independent turn of mind that at times threatened to force a promising career in the German motor industry off the rails. Porsche quarreled with Austro-Daimler and resigned in 1923. He left Austria to join the Daimler company in Stuttgart, Germany. Porsche's design ideas were by no means as outlandish as many around at the time, but he still managed to make many enemies in the conservative German motor industry. He left Daimler after a disagreement in 1928, and when a new venture in Austria collapsed because of the Wall Street crash, Porsche decided he had no alternative but to establish an independent design team in Germany. The shape that was to become the VW Beetle first began to appear in a series of Porsche designs of the early 30s. This is the Porsche Type 12 of 1932. Another element that would become a major component of the VW Beetle, the Porsche torsion bar suspension, was also a product of the early 30s. In 1933, Porsche designed this car, the Type 32, for the German motorbike manufacturer NSU. Only 3 were built before the project was abandoned, but the Type 32 with its air-cooled rear engine and distinctive body shape would be Porsche's starting point for the design of a German Volkswagen, or people's car. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, he ordered the building of a new system of freeways, known as Autobahns. He also wanted to build a small car that could be produced in large numbers and sold cheaply to members of the German working class. Hitler summoned Porsche to a meeting in the autumn of 1933 and set out his design parameters for an air-cooled family car that could be produced for less than 1,000 German Reichsmarks. Hitler knew exactly what he wanted. At later meetings, he even made his own sketches, suggesting modifications to Porsche's Type 32 layout. He said, "It should look like a Beetle. You have only to look at nature to find out what streamlining is."
Dass es der Fähigkeit eines glänzenden Konstrukteurs und der Mitarbeiter des Stabes gelungen ist, die Vorentwürfe für den
Porsche called the project Type 60 and signed a contract for its development in June 1934. In February 1935, Hitler optimistically announced that testing would be complete by the middle of the year.
Möge der Deutsche stolz genug sein, sich ihrer auch zu bedienen.
2 prototypes were built in the garage of Ferdinand Porsche's house. One was an open-topped cabriolet, the other a closed sedan. Porsche's biggest problem was developing a cheap, simple air-cooled engine. He tried several different formats, including a 2-cylinder version, before settling on the 4-cylinder layout that would go on to power more than 20 million Volkswagens. It was called the E-motor, with a capacity of just under 1 liter. Hitler's specifications were strict. The car was to be very fuel efficient, capable of traveling 100 kilometers on just 7 liters of fuel from its front-mounted tank. That's better than 40 miles to the gallon. In 1936, 3 more experimental prototypes were built. They were prepared by Porsche to undertake a punishing test program, which would be carried out by the German Automobile Manufacturers Association. The cars were to cover a punishing 18,000 miles in the Black Forest, through the Alps, and on the new Autobahns. Tests on the prototypes revealed weaknesses, but reports were generally favorable. The Manufacturers Association doubted that the car could be produced for Hitler's price. Hitler took the project and gave it to the German Labor Front. The front commissioned Daimler-Benz to produce 30 cars to be tested by the Nazi SS. Hitler was strongly influenced by Henry Ford. He knew that Ford had built his factories close to canal, river, and sea transport. He decided on a location in northern Germany, close to major canals and the Rhine River. In May 1938, a flamboyant Nazi ceremony was held near the village of Fallersleben to lay the foundation stone for a factory that Hitler intended to rival the giants of Detroit. At the same ceremony, he announced, much to the dismay of Ferdinand Porsche, that the car was to be called the KDF wagon. The letters KDF in German stand for Strength Through Joy. Worse still, the town that would house the new factory's workers would be called KDF Stadt, Town of the Strength Through Joy cars.
Automobiles will return in a moment here on the History Channel. Automobiles.
Work began immediately on the KDF factory. By the spring of 1939, the first stage was completed. The plan was to produce 150,000 cars in 1940, with the output rising by 1943 to 1.5 million. This would make the KDF plant the largest European motor manufacturer by far. Its output would realize Hitler's dream of rivaling the great American automotive giants. An unusual system was invented to sell the output of this factory to the German public. Buyers were issued with a savings book. Payments were made by buying stamps, and the cost of placing the order and insuring the car were added to the basic price. The only car color was blue-gray. By the end of 1938, almost 170,000 cars had been ordered. Distribution of the cars was also unusual. Not until the final stamp had been bought could the customer collect their car, and they literally had to collect it from the factory. There were to be no agents or middlemen in this process. If a buyer couldn't collect it, there would be a delivery charge of around 5% of the purchase price. Two derivatives of the KDF entered development. Their purpose was much more related to Hitler's military plans than the people's car. The Kubelwagen was a rough terrain vehicle able to carry 3 men and a machine gun. It had reduced gearing so that it could be driven at the pace of a soldier walking with a full pack. Its high ground clearance allowed it to cope with a variety of off-road conditions. The second variant was more unusual. It was the Schwimmwagen. The KDF body was replaced with a waterproof tub-like shell. The standard transmission was replaced with a 4-wheel drive arrangement, allowing the vehicle to combine the virtues of an amphibian and an off-road vehicle. By the time Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, the number of Germans ordering the people's car was swelling. The KDF wagon had now reached its production form. The Spartan interior had to be big enough to seat 2 adults and 3 children, to conform with Hitler's decree that the children and the parents should not be separated. It could cover the Autobahn at 100 kilometers an hour, but the coming war would prevent the hundreds of thousands of German families who had placed their order from ever receiving their cars. This is the ultimate form of the KDF wagon, a 1943 model now in the Volkswagen Museum. That was the year in which Hitler had planned production to reach 1.5 million cars. The first KDF wagon came off the production line in August 1940, but by the time this car was produced in 1943, the total output of KDF wagons was a mere 640. Most of them became personal transportation for important members of the Nazi Party. The priorities of war diverted the resources of the factory to the war effort, including parts for aircraft and the V-1 missile. The factory therefore became a target for Allied bombers, which in a series of raids in 1944 managed to destroy 3/4 of the factory. In the wreckage of Germany's post-war streets, Hitler's grandiose scheme for the people's car seemed to be of another age. The idea of a Volkswagen in every German garage was a remote fantasy from the mind of a dead dictator. But something strange was about to happen. The Allied forces occupying Germany needed reliable personal transportation. Their own cars were in short supply, and breakdowns were common. Part of the KDF factory still stood. A young British major, Ivan Hurst, was asked to look at the possibilities.
My initial brief was virtually zero, just to go to Wolfsburg and take charge of a factory, a derelict factory.
Hurst had to assess the condition of the wreckage and decide what was to be done.
And most of the machine tools were still around. They'd been moved into cellars against possible bombing, which of course in the event did happen. The big presses were there, and the press tools were there.
Hurst found a workforce in ex-German prisoners of war from British prison camps.
Production of the Beetle really got going on a small scale, of course, but this was a time when no other manufacturer in Germany was producing cars at all. First got going in March 1946 at a rate of 1,000 cars a month, which was the limit set by the availability of materials.
The British Army placed an order for 20,000 cars. By the end of 1946, more than 7,500 Volkswagens had emerged from the factory. Hitler's people's car was on the Autobahn, fulfilling his specifications of speed and fuel consumption, but under very different circumstances from those he had planned.
In 1947 was a time of complete change of the political climate. The Iron Curtain had come down, the Berlin airlift was on.
While Volkswagen and the rest of Europe coped with the Soviet blockade of Berlin, Major Hurst and his superior officer, Colonel Radcliffe, began to look for a German to take over the running of the expanding Volkswagen factory. Initially, they found it to be a difficult task.
We looked around, asked around to the German Motor Industry Federation and to personal contacts, and found nobody who was prepared to take on the job.
Eventually, Heinz Nordhoff was appointed Volkswagen's general manager. In 1949, the ownership of Volkswagen was transferred to Germany. Nordhoff was taking on a task of immense challenge. The German economy was devastated, and Volkswagen had the potential to be one of the major tools for its reconstruction. Nordhoff's background was in engineering and in truck manufacturer for the Opel company. He decided on a one-model policy. The Volkswagen factory would produce only the Beetle, and there would be no radical changes in appearance. Production accelerated quickly. By 1949, Volkswagen was by far the Federal Republic of Germany's major manufacturer. This vast factory, conceived by Adolf Hitler, destroyed by Allied bombs, and revived by the British Army, was, within 4 years of the end of the war, producing 45% of the country's total industrial output. Export was essential. In spite of major efforts, American interest was slow. An open cabriolet version was developed. Max Hoffman, the New York dealer who pioneered the Porsche sports car market in America, agreed to represent VW. But by 1952, annual sales only numbered in the hundreds. In 1953, Hoffman's franchise was canceled, and Nordhoff began planning the establishment of Volkswagen America. But in Europe, there was no question about the strength of demand. In the early 50s, production accelerated quickly. The small Spartan Volkswagen Beetle was finding its place in the European car market. Some of Volkswagen's promotion at the time may have slightly overstated the Beetle's carrying capacity. And this advertising film may have given the impression of greater towing power than was really available from the small four-cylinder Volkswagen engine.
Automobiles will return in a moment. Here are Beals.
In the early 50s, Heinz Nordhoff's policy of gradual refinement was carefully put into practice. It was now almost 20 years since the basic design of this car had been established by Ferdinand Porsche, and yet, to the market, it was a relatively new car. Its performance was slow, even for the time. Its engine size had been increased to 1,131 cubic centimeters, but top speed was still the 100 kilometers an hour demanded by Adolf Hitler, just a shade over 60 miles an hour. The split rear window was replaced by a one-piece oval in 1953. And more colors were available than in Hitler's time. But no other obvious changes would be made to the look of the car until 1958. Although the Volkswagen itself changed little in the 1940s and 50s, it caused changes in post-war German society that few would have believed possible. The first major change in May 1945 was to the name of the town that housed the Volkswagen factory workers. KDF Stadt, Town of the Strength Through Joy cars, was no longer considered appropriate, and the British-nominated town council agreed that it should become Wolfsburg, after the nearby 14th century castle. Wolfsburg was to become home to a swelling population of post-war German families seeking peace and economic security after the turbulent years of the war. Hitler had established his KDF Stadt near a variety of forms of transportation. In the early 50s, his decision proved to be right. As Volkswagen production expanded, transportation capacity was needed to bring in the vast quantities of raw materials consumed in the creation of tens of thousands of Beetles a month. Hitler had dreamed of rivaling the great American automobile manufacturers, and now Heinz Nordhoff found himself running one of the new industrial giants of Europe. At one point in 1945, there had been a good chance that the whole Volkswagen complex could have disappeared from Germany. The French were interested in moving the complete facility to France as war reparations booty. Only protests from the French automotive industry prevented it happening. For a brief period at the end of the war, Henry Ford II was interested in buying the plant. But there were legal problems in establishing ownership, and the location of the factory, relatively close to the Soviet sector of Germany, was discouraging. Also, the small Beetle, with its air-cooled rear engine, was far removed from the kind of car Ford traditionally manufactured and the American public traditionally bought. Henry Ford walked away from any deal, but the legacy of Ford was still present in the Wolfsburg manufacturing plant. Many of the production tools were of American origin, and its production philosophy was strongly influenced by the elder Henry Ford's ideas. By 1955, the Volkswagen engine had hardly changed from the design established by Porsche's team 20 years earlier. The cylinder bore had been increased, slightly improving power output. But apart from that, it was still the same flat-4 horizontally opposed layout, conceived in Hitler's time. Two pairs of cylinders oppose each other, like fighters in a ring. The format is known by Germans as a boxer motor. In the mid-50s, the Volkswagen plant at Wolfsburg was, for its time, highly automated. But still, an enormous proportion of the assembly line work was done by human hands. And to keep up with production standards and the speed of the line, those hands had to be highly skilled. Because of the low power output of the small Volkswagen engine, the gearbox and transmission were extremely important in getting power to the road as efficiently as possible. The Beetle 4-speed transmission evolved from a simple crash gearbox to an excellent 4-speed unit, easy to operate, fast in action, and highly reliable. The gear lever was located on the floor, and because of the rear engine, there was no transmission hump to take up room in the car's small interior. The efficient combination of engine and gearbox and its contribution to driving simplicity is one of the key elements of the Volkswagen Beetle's success. There was little handwork involved in making the car's body panels. Giant presses forced flexible thin steel into rigid, recognizable body shapes. But putting body parts together was a process of intricate human teamwork and cooperation, depending on speed, accuracy, and economy of movement. The familiar Beetle shape emerged in minutes, riveted, welded, and screwed together by human hands. And while this team was doing its job, dozens of others were doing exactly the same thing across the vast factory floor. Similar teams of human hands, male and female, fitted headlamps, tail lamps, turn indicators, instruments, and all interior body trim as the lines moved on. In the mid and late 50s, demand forced the establishment of other plants in Hanover, Brunswick, and Kassel. From a small workforce made up of German prisoners of war in 1946, less than a decade saw the development of a vast group of specialists, contributing to an unlikely success story. Part of the explanation of that success lies in the Beetle's rugged simplicity. It had no frills. It was structurally sound and hard to break. It was different from any other car available at the time, apart from the Porsche sports cars. But the Beetle was no sports car. It was a simple utilitarian revolution in transportation.
Automobiles will return in a moment here on the History Channel.
By the end of 1954, the number of Beetles that had emerged from the Wolfsburg factory was approaching the 1 million mark. It was short of Hitler's ambition to produce 1.5 million in 3 years to 1943. But for a factory that had been all but destroyed in the war, it was a remarkable achievement. The roads and railways that brought in raw materials carried out finished cars and took many of them far beyond the borders of the Federal Republic of Germany. The cheap, reliable Beetle was finding enthusiastic buyers all over the world. (1955) was a big year for Volkswagen. Volkswagen of America was established, and U.S. sales, only 600 in 1952, exceeded 30,000 for the year. The American market, slow to catch on, was now beginning the move that would eventually make it Volkswagen's most important outside West Germany. Volkswagen's climb to the top was gathering pace. The company based much of its promotion on the characteristics that had been designed into the car by Adolf Hitler. Hitler had insisted on an air-cooled engine because most German working-class houses did not have garages, and an air-cooled engine would be better able to cope with Germany's cold winters. According to this 1955 Volkswagen promotion, it was a great advantage climbing the steep passes of the Alps, where its water-cooled competitors would literally fall by the wayside, boiling. The only use a Beetle driver would have for water in this situation would be to wash the car or relieve a thirst. Hitler probably didn't envision a Volkswagen driver being snowed in at a ski lodge, but the Beetle's cold starting ability made it attractive in the snow, even if the heater was crude and difficult to adjust. The biggest milestone of 1955 came when the 1 millionth Beetle left the production line in Wolfsburg. With this success, Heinz Nordhoff established himself as the third major figure in the development of the Volkswagen, after Adolf Hitler and Ferdinand Porsche. Nordhoff shared the credit with the Wolfsburg workforce. The celebration of the millionth car was a grand occasion. The car itself was painted in gleaming gold, but that was just the beginning. In keeping with the international success of the Beetle, the ceremony marking the occasion had a strong international flavor. The vast crowd watched a lavish show in which every major customer country was represented. The climax was unexpected. Heinz Nordhoff walked into the circular arena to begin a piece of automotive choreography in which the arena itself would become a giant roulette wheel. The colors and the white ball would be represented by Volkswagen Beetles. With the international success of the Beetle, Germany had indeed struck it rich. But there was much more to come. 1 million was a mere fraction of the number of Beetles that would eventually be produced. Volkswagen had been a linchpin of Germany's post-war economic miracle. Since 1949, the Volkswagen factory at Wolfsburg had provided an ongoing injection of employment, wages, and potential for export dollars. As the biggest single entity in the German economy, its effect on the country's economic health was profound. Workers found that they could once again buy consumer goods. Even those who could not yet afford a Beetle of their own could pay for a motorbike. The growth of Wolfsburg reflected a growth of new towns across Germany. A new plant was built at Hanover to manufacture VW engines. Other plants within Germany were on the drawing board. And in the meantime, Wolfsburg was expanding to become the biggest automobile factory under one roof anywhere in the world. Young couples who had faced a bleak future in the wreckage of post-war Germany now found themselves with access to new cars, new furniture, and new houses. It was extraordinary that this surge of prosperity could be brought about by a strange little car with a design almost a quarter of a century old. It was even more extraordinary that many graduates of this new school would go to work at the factory that employed their parents, building Volkswagen Beetles for years to come. There was an exception to Heinz Nordhoff's one-model policy. The transporter was based on the Beetle. It shared the Beetle's engine and transmission. It was introduced in 1950, but by 1956, its manufacture was moved to the new plant at Hanover. Like the Beetle, the Transporter and its many variants were unusual vehicles that found a strong market niche. They were tough and simple and gained ready acceptance in many remote and difficult export markets. They became an icon of the love generation and the utility transportation of choice for earthly and spiritual alike. The Beetle message was spreading across the world. In 1953, a manufacturing subsidiary was established in Brazil. Australia also accepted the Beetle with affection. In 1957, Volkswagen competed successfully against a variety of world cars in Australia's Mobile Gas Rally, a grueling event that took its competitors all the way around the island continent over some of the roughest and most difficult roads in the world. The Beetle made a strong impact in Australia, and in the year of this rally, Volkswagen's second international subsidiary was set up there to manufacture the Beetle down under. In the 60s, a third foreign manufacturing subsidiary was established, this time in Mexico, and the Volkswagen Beetle became a genuinely international car. Only two major changes were made to the Beetle in the 50s and early 60s. Front and rear windows were enlarged, and the engine was redesigned for the first time.
Automobiles will return in a moment here on the History Channel.
In 1956, VW introduced the Karmann Ghia Coupe. Referred to by some as the world's slowest sports car, it offered sports car appearance with Beetle simplicity. In 1961, Volkswagen introduced the 1500, their first new model with the apparent potential to replace the Beetle. It looked more up-to-date, was more powerful, but had nothing like the Beetle's appeal. By the 60s, the Beetle was a cult car. In 1965, 1 million were sold. As well as some outlandish Beetle-based behavior, the 60s saw 2 increases in engine size and continued success. This smooth ride comparison shows how far suspension changes to the Beetle had developed over 3 decades. And the Beetle's evolution continued into the 70s. In 1968, Heinz Nordhoff, the architect of Volkswagen's success, died. Nordhoff was replaced by Dr. Kurt Lotz, who inherited the tough job of finding a successor for the aging Beetle.
Die Zukunftssicherung des Unternehmens, und hier kommt es ja wohl in erster Linie auf Forschung und Entwicklung an.
The Type 4, successor to the 1500, was not to be the answer. It just never had the Beetle's appeal. Volkswagen now owned a majority share of Audi and NSU, and in 1970, Volkswagen launched an NSU design as the VW K70. It too was a disappointment.
Wir waren uns eigentlich seit langer Zeit schlüssig und
In 1971, Rudolf Leiting took over from Kurt Lotz. Beetle development was continuing, and so was the search for a replacement. In 1973 came the Audi-influenced Passat. In 1974, the year of the Arab-Israeli War and rocketing oil prices, Volkswagen made its first ever loss. The Passat was no VW savior. All hopes that year were pinned on an entirely new design, which had nothing in common with the Volkswagen tradition. The new car was released in Europe as the Golf. It was a front-wheel drive hatchback with a lot of catching up to do. In October 1974, Beetle sales topped 18 million, making it clearly the biggest selling car in history. The previous bestseller had been the Ford Model T. Ford's original sales figure for the Model T was just over 15 million in 1927. When the Beetle passed this in 1972, Ford discovered that more than 16.5 million Model Ts had actually been built. But by the end of 1974, there was no more argument. The Beetle was the most popular car of the century. The new Golf range included 2- and 4-door bodies, a choice of engine sizes, and a sporting model with a completely different body, the Scirocco. The Golf proved to be the right car at the right time. The Beetle had taken more than 5 years to sell 1 million. The Golf did it in a mere 31 months. It seemed that Volkswagen had at last found a worthy successor to the Beetle. Beetle production was phased down in the 70s, and on January 19, 1978, the last Beetle produced in Germany left the Emden factory. To Volkswagen, it was the champion of the world, the largest selling car in history. But all champions must eventually retire. There was another sporting analogy. The Beetle's race had been run, and the baton must be handed over. It would be carried forward by the Golf. The Golf appeared to be a worthy successor. By late 1979, sales had reached 3 million, and the 5 million mark was reached 8 years after the car's release.
Der erste millionste Golf wurde nach 31 Monaten dem Vorstand übergeben, von euch fertiggestellt. Der 5 Millionen.
The Golf's success did not quite signal the end for the Beetle. The Golf continued to pour out of the ultra-high-tech Volkswagen factories in Germany and in the USA. Where it had been introduced as the Rabbit, it was produced in Volkswagen's Pennsylvania factory. But as the Golf sales mounted around the world, across the Atlantic Ocean from Germany, in Mexico and Brazil, the Beetle continued to roll off Volkswagen production lines. With half a century of development, and in its time, more sales than any other car in the world, the Volkswagen Beetle is unique in the history of the automobile.
In 1998, a newly redesigned Beetle appeared and proved to be instantly popular, generating long waiting lists. The new model features the engine in front and the trunk in back instead of the other way around as in earlier models. The shape's the same though. It's still obviously a Beetle. For the History Channel, I'm Ed Herman. Thanks for watching.